Hi, Paige. We're gonna take a look at your uh, repetition and the rhythm, as well as the negative space and in between spaces postings that you've done, basically the Notan. So here we are, shared screen. Let's take a look at the overall posting here. We started out with your undulating rhythm examples, alternating and progressive rhythms. Okay, so, clearly, as before in the other videos, I do the overview video. So this is going to be more about the individual aesthetics of your images. It's kind of giving you some observations as to what I'm seeing. And maybe some of the aesthetic tendencies that I'm observing in your imagery. Some of the things that you might have noticed as you are going through these kinds of experiments are that you're going to find multiple examples of each of these. It's not as if each of these repetition exercises or repetition models are going to live in isolation, meaning you'll find a lot of them can be sort of manufactured. In other words, you can take the same grouping of things and depending on where you are, you can influence how they are presented, how they are viewed, either as alternating or as progressive, or even present them as more of an undulating type of rhythm. What we have here in this first one, I think, is sort of just looks like a warm-up for you. You were looking for some kind of repetition, but is it really kind of getting to the heart of a repeating element where we know that it's about that, not of a repeating element, but about a repeating element. And here it is of an object that is a repeating. Now, when we get into this, which is why we wanted to work with shadows later on, you'll notice that it's helping us get to the idea of something rather than the object of something. That's what shadows help us do, that you're finding out later in the project after this one. But you'll see that this is a much sort of more direct way to talk about rhythm and movement than something like this where we're locked into a subject. So getting into something like this where we are working with this undulating rhythm, a repeating kind of element that is much more organic, can really help us. Here you're getting into, I think, is an undulating rhythm of the larger trunks. However, we're also starting something that is this sort of a fourth type of rhythm that we haven't gotten into, which I believe I mentioned it before in our lecture, which is the dissonant rhythm. The dissonant rhythm is when you have this kind of activity. It's not really undulating because there isn't a predictable pattern that we see. It's much more scattered. It's much more of a static energy that happens. So we see a repetition, but there isn't a pattern that we see. So that we call the dissonant rhythm that's happening. So you have this undulating rhythm amongst this dissonant rhythm, which is what I was getting at, where you'll oftentimes see multiples of the same or of two different types of rhythms that are happening. Here we kind of get back into the of a thing. I think you can get somewhere with these kinds of things where you're incorporating that rhythm, but for this kind of experiment, we want to more focus on the thing itself. Good experiment to try to get there, but remember this. There are a couple of things that will always draw attention to a viewer in an image or in a painting or what have you. And the first thing will be a human being. If you have an image of a human being in your art, the viewer is going to want to go to that first. Even if it's a small figure in the background, they're going to kind of find that figure and go to that. it's just human nature to do that. We're going to find that element and go right to it. Human beings would be first. The second might be things like typography or text for us to read, like a sign or something like that. And then the third would be a very high point of contrast, where there's a lot of difference between one tone and another tone. That's going to draw our eye to that as well. So we have a lot of that happening. There will seem to be a lot of conflict. It's more about knowing that those things are going on, and how to use them. So as we study composition, as we study how to arrange things to communicate the things that are important to us, it's going to be vital that we understand some of these triggers that we can use in order to get the viewer to do what we want. And even here, when we're not really showing a face, we're not really showing the part of a person that we think would draw people to it, what we see first is a person, not necessarily the rhythm that we're going for. Here we're getting more into something where I would identify it as an alternating rhythm rather than the undulating rhythm. Unless we're talking about down here, where there is some movement there, but it's getting into more of that dissonance that we mentioned earlier. Here, you definitely starting to work with alternating rhythm. You got the pairs and the twos. What will help you with that is going to be to line things up a little bit more clearly in the two-dimensional format. That's going to give you more of the comparative. I'll show you an example of that, and to do that, I'll kind of come off of the screen share over here. Let me bring this menu back over. For some reason, it got over onto a different screen. Here we go. We'll stop sharing just for a moment. Okay, so in an alternating rhythm, what we want to do is set up this pattern where we have a comparative. That's the real benefit of doing the alternating rhythm, is because you can create this sort of dichotomy, this tension between objects, where it's very similar. I have one hand like this and another hand like maybe like this, right? And so you have these two objects, which are very similar. The closer I have them together like this, the more tension that they're going to create. The farther away, the less tension that they're going to have. Now, if I have them straight up like this, they're equal in terms of their importance. So if I pull them up like this and put them together like this, they're very equal in their importance because they're the same size, they're in the same plane. However, if I do this, right, then there are two objects. They are even identical, but one is now taking precedence over the other one because one is closer to the screen than the other. This also sets up what we would almost presume to be a progressive pattern, because you have one forward, one back. The next step would logically be here, and the next step would logically be even farther forward. You see what I mean? So if we have this sort of dual thing that's happening where they're on the same plane, even if it's just subtle like this, same plane, not here, but what we'll end up getting is a much more direct comparative relationship rather than this subtle kind of off comparative that's kind of going on, let's see, with this one. You see how those are slightly off? If you had come over to the side just a little bit and compare them, you'd be much better off. You've also done a vertical, which is fine. You might have gotten more tension if you had gone the horizontal way. I do like how kind of organized you have made it here, how plain and kind of layered you've made it. This is really quite interesting. That a shot just needs a little bit of cleanup to make that happen. See how much more of a comparative we're getting because of that? These kind of elements here, you may not have seen that in the shot up here as well. A way to figure that stuff out is to do some sample photographs where you're putting things on the edge and then test to see if you're seeing them or not. What I mean is a lot of photographs in your cameras, a lot of the rangefinders, the view that you see when you're taking the picture, don't give you 100% of what you're actually capturing. And so what you want to do is to be able to know how much you're getting or not getting, kind of do a couple of samples so you'll calibrate or at least know in your mind just how much you will and won't get. Because sometimes you don't see this and it ends up being included, which only means later on you have to crop. You have to get rid of it because it's not contributing to the overall information. So it's the kind of thing that you want to avoid when you can. So getting to know your camera by just doing some samples and figuring out things on the edges, whether they're included or not, will be an important thing. Cool Fall Raven bags. I like Fall Raven. I do that. I don't know, maybe you work at a Fall Raven, or you were at the shop or something, or maybe you have 2 bags. That's cool. Here again, good comparative study. Maybe a bit more organizational will work. It looks like you might have 2 bags because this one looks kind of worn. So you probably have 2 Fall Raven bags. These are nice. I really like this color, by the way. Don't let me get on tangent here. Anyway, yes, very good balance between those 2 imagery. Pay very close attention, though, to these edges here, how these are happening, right? We start doing that in the next project. Good. See how lining them up kind of changes things for you? So you kind of got that. Hopefully you understand now what I was talking about with that comparative contrast kind of situation. Progressive, you seem to have no problem with here because you're working with that leading line. You got the edge. This seems to be the more natural one for you to be working with because you're just going right to it. It seems to be the thing that you already know how to do. For just about everybody, there's one of those things that we already know how to do. And for those, what I would say is see where you can go to push it farther. Of all of these, this is going to be the one that I think is the most sort of resolved or complex or interesting, if you want to sort of boil it down to that. And it has to do with the quality of light, the use of shadows, and the arrangement of all the other elements. Quality of light, which is giving you all of this sort of streaming light over the sidewalk. You got 1, 2, 3 kind of repetition. You get the repetition of this over here. You get the repetition happening from the fence. You've even got some of the alternating rhythm happening toward the back here. Really kind of an overall sort of balanced image. This one's getting pretty good as well, but I think that the lighting is not quite as resolved as this one. This one's excellent as well, though. So it clearly shows that you are much more comfortable working with this kind of rhythm. This one's not as resolved because it's sort of one note. You don't really have it going anywhere, the leading lines. But nonetheless, it looks like the progressive rhythm is really your strong suit. So continue with that push. See how you can make it more subtle, the progressive rhythm, so that we don't immediately know that it's a progressive rhythm, but that kind of grows on us. But then work with some of the ones that seem to have given you a little bit more of a challenge. So getting back into here with the shadows, the black and white is working really well for you here. Black and white is all about shades and tone, which is what makes it really a appropriate way to go with the spaces in between and the shadows. Here it looks like you really kind of got it. These shadow patterns that you're using are outstanding. I mean, look at this. This is just showing you exactly what we're talking about when we say the inner workings of a shadow, how that repetition can work. I'm just so proud of you for making an image like this, which is basically of nothing, right? You made a photograph of the ground, of blank cement ground, yet look how beautiful and active it is. If you can make a picture of a blank cement ground and make it active and beautiful, imagine what you could do with something that is active and beautiful. This is what photography is all about. This is what you can get excited about, is the power that you have to be able to make images of nothing and be able to get them to be exciting. Now you know you're working with a visual language, not just making renderings of objects. Photography does that by itself, but when you can take it and impose your own kind of language to objects, that's when you're getting to be able to communicate and speak. These are excellent, Paige. Really, really good. Here, you're using a sort of an aberration, a kind of a haze or a reflection that's going on. It's kind of really an interesting thing. Here, we would want to get into what we call a shallow depth of field. You may not have that control on this particular camera or know what shallow depth of field means. It would have been a challenge to do it at this distance, but it would have been helpful if these cars were not in focus, if they were blurry. And the main focus was on this area right in here. That's something that we work on in other classes, though. Again, these are all really, really working well. The spaces in between don't seem quite as well resolved as the shadows, only because it looks like you're trying to figure out where they are, and we get a little bit more into objects than the wonderful interplay that you're doing here. This seems so natural and so free. These are still excellent, excellent photographs, but they look a little bit more like you're trying to figure them out, how to use it. Doesn't mean that they are not well accomplished. Anytime I talk about like, okay, so these have a little bit of work to do or this way or that way, it really has to do with the topic that we're doing, not necessarily the quality of the photos. The quality of the images can be outstanding, but when we're talking about the use of the in-between spaces, you know, there is a little bit more too much information going on here to qualify them as being kind of negative space. Are they really, you know, playing a dominant role, or are we getting into more of it being about the positive space here? That's really where it is. I think the strongest images are going to be these, where you feel you kind of got it right away. If you're able to do this with, you know, an image like this, that's when you know that you really have this idea of how to create a balance between what you're making an image of and what is between the objects of the images you're making up, the objects of those things. We work even further on this in our lighting course, and we get into all of that stuff. So these are the kinds of things that that you build on as you create your own sort of, I guess, interpretation of language. This visual language that we're using. This is quite interesting. You're using almost a reversal of the shadow idea here, where you're using spots of light rather than spots of shadow. Really quite interesting here. But I think we could probably explore this idea of spaces in between a little bit further on your own, of course, to get a little bit better grasp of how to use emptiness even more efficiently, so that you're really striking a balance between what is and what isn't there, and the space in between those things, and how to really activate that space. So that's what I have for you. These are excellent, excellent photos. I really am encouraged by all the things that you're doing, particularly by those wonderful shadow images. Those are just fantastic. We will see you in the studio. If you have other questions, I'll be happy to talk to you face to face on them. All right. See you later. Bye-bye now.